I realized I hadn't done this year yet, so we should do this always once towards the beginning of the year. And that is to introduce the Targumim. And then we'll say a word from a Targum, but I want to introduce it. So let's see if you guys remember, because I do this once a year. How many Targumim do we have access to? The Targumim as in the traditional, let's call them translations for a moment, but that's a mistranslation of So what do we have? Go ahead, so tell me. So there's definitely Onkelos. Now, where does Onkelos originate from? Meaning, which rabbinic culture is it the Targum of? You're correct, Rome. But which is He's Bavel. This is the Targum that was used in Bavel. Right? What is typical of Onkelos? What does he try to do? It's not a trick question. No, we'll get to that. What is his basic goal? Translate. Yes. Now, there are certain things that he does not translate literally pretty consistently, right? He's pretty much a literal translation, except, as Sean correctly notes, that whenever there seems to be something which would lead to anthropomorphism, to believing that God had a body, Onkelos retranslate it, which is something the Rambam picks up on and the Rambam is a big fan of. So, whenever you have God, pretty much anything, right? You'll have him say things like, rather than it being the arm of God, so then, he'll something like that, right? He'll translate it that way, and often he'll say, rather than God, did something, it was bim memre, he did it with his word, or something like that, right? He'll find ways. But usually he is a literal translation into Babylonian Aramaic. Okay? On a given parsha, I never did the numbers exactly because I'm not that good. But there aren't many major changes. There are some little instances where you'll find grammatical issues, where there's a grammatical ambiguity just in terms of interpretation. Onkelos is providing parshanut. But fundamentally, he tries to be a literal translation, with the major exception being anthropomorphism and random other places throughout the Torah. But the second tradition of Targum is the tradition of Targumim, the Targumim Eretz Right? Now, the Targumim Eretz are not just providing translation. They are very actively providing interpretation, usually midrashic interpretation. So, and it's very helpful to understand this, because often a midrash will say something you don't quite understand what it's trying to do, the gap it's trying to fill in the story. If you look at the Midrashei Eretz Yisrael, you'll see that where there's a gap in the story, the Targum will fill it in the actual translation of the Psukim. Now, the only complete Targum we have from Eretz Yisrael is Targum Ktav Yad Romi, or known as Neophyte, which is one that we found recently in the Vatican. We have a fragment Targum from that same period, from essentially the Chazal period, in Eretz Yisrael, which in the red Mikra is called the Targum Yerushalmi. And then you have Targum so-called Yonatan, pseudo-Jonathan, in academic lingo. In Hebrew academic lingo, it's the Miyuchas LeYonatan, the attributed to Yonatan. It is not Yonatan ben Uziel. We know that. Chazal say that Yonatan ben Uziel wrote a Targum on Nevi'im and was prevented from writing on Ketuvim because it would have revealed the secrets of Mashiach and things like that. If he had written on Chumash, we would know. Probably what happened was at some point he just said Taf Yud, Targum Yerushalmi, just like the other one, and someone said, Taf Yud, Targum Yonatan, that sounds good. It's wrong. Targum Yonatan does contain a lot of those same traditions as Yerushalmi and Neophyte, but it also has a lot of later material, which we've talked about in some parshiot, such as when Esav marries the daughters of Ishmael, the names are Fatima and whatever, which you know already. That insertion, at least, is post-Islam, because otherwise, why would you be talking about the wife and daughter of Muhammad as the spouse of Esav? So there is later material that goes in, but it is a complete Targum. It just comes from, there are different strata in it, which are basically impossible to figure out, I think. But that is it. I want to show you just one or two cases in this week's parsha just to understand what this looks like, so that you get a picture of what goes on here. So if we go to the Akeidah, for example, the Akeidah starts off, Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ela. And it was after these things, Ve'elokim nisad Avram. So God tested Avram. So how does Uncle translate it? V'havei batar pitkama ha'elain. After these things. That's it. That's how he translates it, right? When I was in YU, someone told me there is a Syriac class, which is like, old school, like 2,000-year-old Aramaic, taught by I forget if I think he's a Arab Christian, I think. But he was talking to one of my friends, and he said, "Oh, you do Shtai Mikra with Targum. So obviously you know what Wihwa Bisar Piskama Hazain means." At which the guy just stared at him, "What are you talking about?" But that's the, academic way of reading V'havei Batar Pitkama Hadain, right? Because the Vav is a W, so Wihwa, and Batar, right, the Taf becomes, or the Thaf is a Thaf, so Batar. Anyways, and Dalet, obviously, without a Dagesh, is Hazain, right, because it's a The. Took a minute, but eventually he got it. But Ungle just translates it as, after these things. But all the Midrashim, everyone wants to know, what's the big gap in this question that Rashi quotes? After what? Right? So we're used to the Mefarshim adding this in, like Rashi, right? Rashi says, after what? But if you look at the translation, okay, quote unquote, and this is why translation is a bad translation of the word Targum, okay? This is how Yonadan, for example, translates the pasuk. V'havei batar pitkamei ha'ilein. It was after these things. Min dinatsu Yitzchak v'Yishmael, when Yitzchak and Ishmael fought. Yishmael have amarli chamo lemeirut yad abba da'ana brei bruchra. Yishmael told Yitzchak, I will inherit because I am the Bechor. The Yitzchak have amarli li chame lemeirut yad abba da'ana bar Sarah intite va'ant bar Hagar amta. Amta de'imi. And Yitzchak said, I'm going to inherit because you are the son of Hagar, the servant of my mother, and I am the son of Sarah, the wife of Avram. Ane Yishmael. So Yishmael responded, Amar, Ane zakai yatir minach, da'ana idzarit l'tleisar shnin v'in havat tzivoti l'ma'akva lo havein amasar nafshi l'tgazara. Va'ant idgazart batem nayonin ilavad ban minda dilma lo havet masar nafshach l'tgazara. Yishmael said, well, I'm a bigger tzaddik than you. I have more merit than you because I could have rejected getting a Brit Milah because I got it at 13. And you were a baby. So you couldn't have said no. So you've never sacrificed, right? You've never been Moser Nefesh. Mater Yitzchak. So Yitzchak responded, V'amar hana yomaya bar klatin v'shit shnin v'ilu boykut jabrechu l'chule evare lo havei ma'akav min lo havei ma'akav. He said, I am 36 years old, and if God had asked all my limbs, I wouldn't hold back. Min yad, immediately, ishtamadu pitkame he'ilin kadam mare alma. These words were brought before God. Umin yat memre dadonai nasiyat Abraham, amar le Abraham, amar la ha'ana. So God said to Abraham, and he said, here I am. First, that's one pasuk in Targum, okay? I want to point out two things. One is that he fills in the gaps, right? But he also does something. There's also a translation issue that he weighs in on, not just interpretation, which is, what does the word dvarim mean? So the word dvarim can either mean things or words. This is his very long-winded midrashic explanation for why he opted for the translation of words rather than things. Meaning, it's not this happened after those things, it's this happened after the words, meaning the fight, between Yishmael and, right? So this is the type of thing that you will find extensively in Targum. And like I said, what it does, first of all, I think this is a good example where it shows you the gaps that the Midrashim are responding to, because when you see it placed in the Pasuk as part of the Targum, you realize in Pshat what it's doing, right? What is the question it's responding to, and also it provides a thematic, contextual explanation for certain very literal it provides context for the word choices that he uses to translate. If I want to give you just a little bit more, I'll give you one or two more examples. Just here, so remember yesterday we talked about this and we said one of the big gaps in the end of it is Vayeshev Abraham el Ne'arav, that Avram goes back and not Yitzchak. So obviously that's something the Midrashim are going to have to jump on. So not surprisingly, what does the Targum say? Udivaru malachim miroma Yitzchak v'ovilu levei midrasha d'shem Rabbah. The Malachim took Yitzchak and brought him to the Beis Medrash of Shem. V'havei taman tlat shnin, and he was there for 3 years. Uvahu yoma, and on the same day that the Malachim took Yitzchak away, Tav Avram levat ulemei. Avram went back. Right, so again, and one more time, if you weren't convinced about the way he works, one more, Vayhi achar hadivarim. When's the next Vayhi achar hadivarim? Right after the Akeidah, what happens? Vayhi acharei hadvarim ha'eleh, vayugad l'Avraham le'mor hinei yalda milka gam hi banim l'nachor achicha. After this, so Avram was told that his brother has kids. Okay? Now again, dvarim can either mean things or words. What do you think? So no, actually here, I don't know. I don't know which one it is, but let me read you how he reads the pasuk. Vahave batar pitkamahi elaine. It was after these something, pitkamin. Min batar de kafat Avram Yitzchak. After Avram had bound Yitzchak. Va'azal sitna. Yeah, he says words. And the Satan had gone. Vitani levat Sarah. The Avram nechas Yitzchak. And he had told Sarah that Avram had sacrificed Yitzchak. V'komat Sarah ufagnat. Vishtakant umitat min anika va'ata Avram uvat be'archa v'tanya l'Avraham l'meimar yildit milka uvi arvacha b'tzchut t'achtei l'meilat benin l'chor l'nachuch. After the Satan had told Sarah that Avram had killed, and Sarah got up and died from these words. So, ... Right, so again, it reads Pitkama as words, but then you got to say what words? The words that the Satan had told to Sarah that led to her to die after those words. So now there needs to be a replacement, because now Avram needs to find a wife for Yitzchak. After those words, he finds out that there's a child born to his family. But in general, like I said, what's important to realize is not just that, yes, Targum Onkelos tries to translate with a few exceptions, and Targum Yonatan adds Midrash, but that it's not quite Midrash. It's still a Targum, meaning he doesn't bring any Midrash. He brings Midrashim that, there's a problem in the flow of the text that he's filling in the gap, right? because that's Targum-esque. And the second thing is that often those contextual clues will help you understand the translation that he's doing. In this case, in both cases, he comes up with a conversation to explain why dvarim means words and not things. Now, just remember that the Targum originally was read in shul alongside the Kriyat Torah. There was a second person doing it, which meant that in Bavel what was happening was there was a translator. But that's not what's going on in Eretz Yisrael. As they're reading the Parsha, there's a Midrashic shir going on, filling in the picture from the Midrashic world. So it is a very different experience. Okay, those are some insights from the Targum, and hopefully, maybe periodically we'll draw on Targum, but I just wanted I figured it's November and we hadn't done anything, and the Akeidah has such good examples as to the methodology of, especially Targum AUDIO-KosherTube. It was a good time to talk about it. Okay.